All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the fish dissection. My name is Ipsita, and I am a public programs intern for UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. We conduct research, education, and outreach for healthy coastal ecosystems and communities. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa to start our fish dissection.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Ipsita. My name is Lisa, and I am one of the curators here at the UGA Aquarium. And as a curator, part of my job is taking care of all of the animals that we have here at our aquarium, as well as all the systems that they're living in. But I also get to do all of the awesome education programs like our fish dissection that we're doing today, which happens in one of our labs here, but we have classrooms and we have field experiences and boats. So I get to do all of those as well, and it's super exciting. Fish are one of my favorite things to teach about, and I'm really excited that you're joining me for a fish dissection today. What I wanted to do first is I wanted to get started with a little bit of an introduction to fish, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, with some background information about fish that will be sort of helpful in looking at fish in general, but also helpful with our dissection. So let's get started with that. All right, so first I wanted to start out by defining what a fish is, all right? So there are 4 characteristics that are important to fish. So each of these characteristics by themselves doesn't necessarily make a fish, but when you put them all together, they make up what we know as fish. So they are aquatic, we know that much. And again, there's a lot of aquatic animals out there, but fish specifically are swimming with fins. They are breathing with gills, and they are a vertebrate, so they have a backbone. There are some animals that have fish in the name but are not a fish, so I wanted to make sure we knew about those as well. So what are some things that are not a fish? The first one, starfish. We like to call them sea stars since they're not actually a fish. They don't have any bones inside of their body. We also have jellyfish that have fish in the name but are not a fish, so we can call those sea jellies instead. Again, they have no bones inside of their body. And we have our friend the dolphin here, and dolphin are aquatic. They have fins, or what we might call flippers, and they are vertebrates, but remember, they are mammals like us, so they're breathing air through lungs. And I wanted to give you a couple numbers here to sort of put things in perspective. Fish are a huge group of animals. They make up 60%, so more than half of all the different types of vertebrates that you find on our planet here. So the number of species of fish outnumbers all of the other groups of vertebrates combined. So there are more species of fish than there are mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians all put together. So a huge group. And I have a question for you. This next chart here at the bottom shows a couple numbers. So there are some species of fish that are living in saltwater, some that are living in freshwater, and some that can live in both. So we're going to bring up a poll for you here, and you can click the answer. And the question is, what % of fish live in salt water? So we're looking at a % of species living in salt water.
And you're looking for that box that has a green header. And again, your options are 41%, 1%, or 58%. And we do have answers coming in.
All right.
It looks like right now it's pretty split between 41 and 58, but it does look like we'll give it just one more second, last chance to get your answers in. Just about everybody. I am going to go ahead and end the poll and share results so you can see what people thought.
Awesome, thanks. So this was split exactly evenly. And you guys, this is a sort of a tough one, and it's a little bit tricky. The answer is actually 58%. So it's kind of a crazy thought that only 1% of our globe is covered in fresh water, but they still have that fresh water still has almost half of the amount of species of fish that are out there. And our oceans are huge, and they still only have a little bit over half. That 1% there is the species that can move back and forth between both freshwater and saltwater. So that's just some very basic background about fish. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how you can classify them. So there are 3 major groups. The first group is the jawless fish. So this is lampreys, like the photo here, and hagfish. They're the most ancient group of fish, and they do not have a movable jaw like other fish do. So pretty small group. The next largest group is our cartilaginous fishes. So this is our sharks, skates, rays, and chimeras. And they're special because they have skeletons that are made entirely of cartilage. So if everybody takes your finger and wiggles the end of your nose, you can feel your ears, and actually in your joints too. That's where we would find cartilage on our bodies. But the cartilaginous fish like sharks and skates, they have entire skeletons made of cartilage. So it's still got some structure, but it's not as hard as bone. Now we do have bony fish that do have skeletons made of bone. And there are about 30,000 species of bony fish out there. So you might see that I have a question mark there. And that's because it's a very large group of fish to keep track of. Sometimes these fish can hybridize with each other. So you'll get hybrid species. We're discovering new species every day. And sometimes what you thought was one species actually turns out to be another one. So you might see slightly different numbers out there, but somewhere around 30,000 species. Now, with 30,000 species out there, it's going to be hard for anybody to know everything there is to know about all these different types of fish. So what you can actually do is you can look at some things about a fish's body that are going to tell you a little bit more about where they live, maybe what they like to eat or how they live. So you can look at the shape of the body. So the first one I have here listed is fusiform. So we're looking straight at the fish. Examples of this one are ones that are sort of maybe teardrop shaped or like a torpedo. So they're really typically pretty fast. They can cut through the water really easily. And you can see this is a little brackish water fish that lives in the Gulf. And they have this one has sort of a classic fusiform shape. Now there are depressiform fishes like our stingrays and skates. And those are ones that are flattened from top to bottom. And they have their eyes sitting on top of their body. So these are our flattened fishes. And these are a fish that is living on the bottom. Sometimes they'll even cover themselves in sediments like sand or gravel. The other flattened fish we have is compressiform fishes. So those are flattened side to side, super skinny like this little filefish here. They can be good at swimming in schools, and they can also fit through cracks and crevices in coral reefs and rocky reefs. And our last one is a globiform fish. So these are pretty rounded, much more so than our fusiform fish, not super fast. And an example of these is a striped burrfish. But other types of puffers, or if you're in the southeast here, an oyster toadfish is a great example of a nice globiform body shape. You can also look a little bit at the color and patterns of fish. So if you're somebody that likes to go fishing, maybe likes to go to aquariums, you can look at just the external, colors and patterns and shape of the body to learn a little bit about it. The colors and patterns of fish are typically used for predator avoidance. So they don't want to get eaten, so they're trying to avoid their predators by a number of different ways. And sometimes used for communication, especially when it comes to mating and finding mates. So I wanted to show you just a few examples. The disruptive coloration that you can see on the screen here, these are Atlantic spadefish. And interestingly, zebras also employ this as well. So not aquatic, but they do have disruptive coloration. And this breaks up the outline of the body. So these vertical bars along the fish break up the outline, and it also makes it really hard for a predator to pick out just one fish from a school. So this is an example of predator avoidance. Another thing that, let me go back. Another thing that our sharks employ, and also skates and rays, it's not limited just to fish. Also, dolphins and whales and penguins have counter shading. And this is where they have the underside of their body being really light, maybe a light gray or white, and the top of their body is dark. And that helps if there is an animal below them, especially something like a predator or maybe even their prey that they're trying to hide from. If you're looking from underneath, you're going to see the light bottom of their body against the light coming down from the top of the ocean. And also, if you're looking from the top, you're going to see a dark outline of the body against the dark depths of the ocean. So it helps them to sort of blend into their surroundings. So that's counter shading. Another example of blending into the surroundings is camouflage. And camouflage is really cool. So fish and some other animals have special color changing cells that actually help them to sort of match their surroundings. So I have another poll for you. This one is a little bit tricky, but we have a poll, and the question for this one is, what is the name of the color changing cells in fish? So it might be tricky, but take your best guess.
And your options are nematocysts, chromatophores, dermal cells, or chlorophyll. I know this is a tricky one. No worries if you're not sure, you can take a guess. I can see some answers starting to come in. Looks like we've got lots of different thoughts out there, lots of people submitting answers, so thank you all for doing that. We have answers in all 4 categories. We'll give it just a few more seconds, so last chance. Go ahead if you're still pondering, take a leap, choose an option, doesn't matter if you're wrong. It does look like we have most folks, so I'm going to end the polling and share results so you can see what people thought.
Awesome. So the highest category here is chromatophores, and that is correct. Chromatophores are the color changing cells that you'll see in fish and some other animals, especially like squid and octopus. So these are very special cells inside their body, and they have tiny little grains of pigments inside of those cells, and they can actually shift those pigments around inside of the cells to change color. So you can see this nice picture of a flounder here using those chromatophores to blend in. Awesome job, everybody. All right, so let's look a little bit more technically at some of the parts of a fish. So I have some external anatomy here for you. This is a red drum, or you might know it as a redfish. And I didn't point out the specific eye or mouth on here because everybody is pretty familiar with those things, but there's a number of fins here that you may or may not be familiar with. And each of those fins are serving a different and very specific function, but altogether those fins are helping that fish to go exactly where they want to go and how fast they want to get there. Some of the fins are used for steering or stopping or for powering their swimming. We also have a lateral line here, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, but that's part of their sensory system. We have the nares. So we're not going to talk in depth about those, but those are actually like nostrils on a fish. And so they can bring water through those nares and pick up scents in the water. And we are going to talk more in depth about gills and operculum, but what you see here is the operculum, and that's the bony plate that covers their very fragile gills. So we'll talk about both of those. And then also on this guy, there's something cool. There's an eye spot or a false eye. So other animals can employ this too. So they have a false eye, meaning that if you're a predator and you are going after this redfish, maybe it's a small redfish, you might mistake the false eye on the tail for its actual eye on the head. Maybe some predators don't have as good of eyesight as others, or it could be kind of murky water. So if you're this redfish, you're definitely going to want a little bite out of your tail rather than a bite out of your head where you have lots of important organs. So there's a false eye that helps to protect them from predators. So those are the major external parts, and I'm going to talk a little bit about one of those. We did mention a mouth, and we didn't specifically, I didn't put it on there because everybody is pretty familiar with where a mouth would be located on a fish. But it's important to remember that there are a lot of different types of fish mouths out there. So a fish with teeth, like our sheep's head here, or a shark, or maybe a kingfish, those are fish that are going to be carnivores. So they're looking to either crunch things up or bite things. But you have some fish that just have little tiny mouths for picking things out of a coral reef, like a trumpet fish. And this guy, some of the biggest fish out there in the oceans are actually feeding on the smallest animals in the oceans. So a basking shark and a whale shark, those are filter feeders, and they're using special parts on their gills on the side of their body to help filter out tiny plankton like krill from the oceans to eat. But really a specialized type of mouth for an animal tells you, that they have a specialized way of feeding. They can tell you a little bit about what they like to eat, where they might be finding that food, and how they're actually eating it. And I did mention the sensory systems too. So one thing that's really cool about fish is they have some extra senses that we do not have, all right? So the first of those is a lateral line. So if you look at some of these fish over here on the left, you might notice a little line of scales along the side of their body, and I've outlined a few for you. So it's a nice little curving line, and the lateral line is an extra sense, and that sense is, being able to pick up movements in the water. So just like we have, hairs on our arm, and if you touch those hairs, you can feel something that might be around you, or even if the wind is blowing. That's a little bit like what these guys have with the lateral line. So it's a very special line of scales, and these scales all connect, and they allow water to come in through little tubes, and they tickle these little hair cells that are underneath of the skin, and that sends a message to their brain telling them that they've sensed something on this side of their body or on that side. So a special extra sense that they have that's really cool. Something that is cool for our sharks in particular is called these ampullae of Lorenzini. So that's kind of a tricky word, or a couple words, but these are basically like tiny pits or tiny holes on the side of their face, maybe underneath their jaw, and they can actually pick up the electromagnetic pulses, so they can sense beating hearts of animals around them, and that's something that helps them pick up know if there's food around. Hammerhead sharks have these all underneath of their head, and they actually search on the bottom for stingrays. So they may not be able to see them hiding in the sand, but they have these ampullae of Lorenzini that help them to pick up this, the stingrays that might be around for them to eat. So two really cool senses that they have. There we go. There's one more thing I wanted to mention, in particular, again, about sharks, but also skates and rays, so our cartilaginous fishes. I don't want to talk too much about internal anatomy now, since we're going to do that in our dissection, but I did want to just mention that there's a lot of similarities between fish and other animals, even like humans, like a heart, a brain, a stomach, but there's also some major differences. We haven't really mentioned a swim bladder, but we'll talk about that. And I did mention gills. So typically fish have a hard bony covering on the side of their, the side of their head that protects their gills, which are very fragile. But sharks and skates and rays have 5 gill slits on the side of their body, 5 to 7 gill slits. And what they typically do is just swim with their mouth open so that water flows into their mouth and over their gills. And something that some of our bottom-dwelling fish have developed is called spiracles. And this is a little hole that you can see behind their eye. And as you can see on the very bottom here, our guitar fish likes to, stingrays and skates will actually cover themselves with sand and sediment so that they can hide from predators and maybe to try and find prey. But since they're, covering up their gills, which are actually on the underside of their body, they've developed this little hole behind their eye to pull water down through their gills and push it out the bottom. So that's something really cool that they've developed to let them have a life on the bottom. Now, I don't want to talk for too long. I want to go ahead and get started. So I have a whiting here on your screen, and I have a whiting here with me today, and we're going to do a dissection. So we're going to learn a little bit about the internal anatomy of these guys. But Kayla's going to share a few more things with you while I make sure I am all set up. And if you have any questions, this would be a time where we might be able to answer a question or two. If you have them so far, you can always type them in the chat box. But we can take questions throughout and at the end as well.
Thank you, Lisa. So while she is transitioning, I wanted to share a little bit about how we get the fish that we use for our dissections. So if any of you have done dissections at school or at camp or somewhere else, you might have worn gloves, and you'll notice that Lisa is not doing that today. And one of the reasons is that it is not preserved in any kind of chemical. So all of the fish that we use are fresh ones that have been caught on our trawling vessel and then frozen and used for education. So if you're interested in more of that process, we are going to have a public program on July 21st where you get to meet our boat captains and meet some of the boats in our collection and see what kind of work they do. But I just want to give you a sneak peek. So I'm going to back up a little bit so that you can see this net on your screen. This is called a trawl net. And basically the way that it works is it's dragged behind our trawling vessel. So it's going along the bottom of the tidal creek or river. ocean and collecting organisms along the bottom. And that water is going to pull that net open. It's got weights on one end here and floats on the top. So as it's dragging through the water, it is collecting organisms. And we have a permit from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources in order to collect some organisms for food for the aquarium, which is great because it means that then the animals in the aquarium are eating things that they would be naturally eating in the estuary. But it also allows us to collect organisms for research as well as for education. So a handful of those get saved and used for education. I'm just looking here to see if we have Lisa is back. And so if you do have questions, you can add those to the chat and we'll ask Lisa about them. But I'm going to go ahead and make it so that you can see the dissection that she has set up. And we'll turn it back over to her. And Lisa, before you get started, we do have one question from the chat box asking what your favorite fish is.
Oh, that is so tricky. Let's see. Well, I have a couple. It's hard to pick just one. I really love stingrays. I do like sharks too, but I actually like stingrays a little bit more. I think they're very graceful when they're swimming. In terms of fish that we have here at our aquarium, I really like our clear nose skates. And I really like filefish too, but again, it's kind of hard to pick a favorite because they do sort of have personalities and they all have different behaviors, which are kind of fun and interesting. But that's a great question. Any other questions, burning questions before we get started, or are we okay to get started, Kayla?
I think we are okay to get started, but feel free to add questions in the chat box as we go along.
All right, perfect. So what you see here is my dissecting tray, and I have some tools with me as well. And this is our whiting. So again, this is a fish that's from our river here, and it's not preserved, it's just been frozen. And so I just wanted to sort of show you what the fish looks like before we get started. So we talked about the body shape, different parts of the body and features. So is there anything that you notice about our fish or certain observations that you have? If you do have observations, you can type them in the chat box. So think about the things that we looked at, even color and pattern. And maybe it's a burning question that sort of comes up in looking at the fish, or maybe it's just something that you notice about it. So go ahead and add anything in the chat box if you have it.
Lisa, while folks are adding in their observations, we did have a question about whether there's a difference in saltwater and freshwater dissection.
I think the dissection would be mostly the same, but you might find differences in the internal organs, depending on if the fish is found, you know, in a number of freshwater fish can be herbivores, and there's definite differences between herbivores and carnivores, and maybe some differences depending on if it's a cold water fish or freshwater, or I mean a warmer water fish. But you would do the dissection mainly the same, but you might be asking yourself different questions about the fish.
Thanks, Lisa. And we had a number of questions about the mouth and observations in that region. Okay. So one person is wondering, what is the bump on the lip for?
Are we talking about the one on the bottom here? I think that's probably what we're talking about. So that's a good question. So let's talk just a second about the mouth, if we had a lot of questions here. If you look, I can kind of open its mouth. You can actually see a few little teeth in there. So this guy does have some little spiky teeth. So we might think that they are, like I said, carnivores, looking to grab things to eat them, like small fish. And they have what's called a barbel on the bottom of their body. You can see it hanging off the bottom jaw. And that is sort of like the whiskers in a catfish that are helping it to sense what's around it and find food. So some other fish that have these sensory organs are black drum, but they actually look like they have a little bit of a beard on the bottom of their body. So that's just a little bit about the mouth. And one thing that's interesting too is that you can open up the mouth, and do you see how this guy, its mouth opens downward below it? So that's indicating that it's going to be looking for food down below. If a fish's mouth opens right on the end of its body, it might be going straight forward to look for food. Maybe some of our big predators like tuna or mackerel. And if a fish's mouth opens upward to the top of its body, it might be looking towards the surface for things like little minnows. Whereas this one might be finding shrimp or crabs or little worms that are living in the sediments. Any other observations about anything else?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. So there's actually been a number of really good observations of people noticing things that you had mentioned, features you had mentioned earlier on. One of those, Gabrielle noticed the lateral line. Rachel noticed the fusiform body shape. And we also had someone notice the counter shading as well.
Yeah, so that's awesome. Great job, guys. So they do have a nice defined lateral line here. And one thing that's interesting when you do a dissection, it's a little bit tricky for us today, but if you do a dissection, you can actually pull off some of the scales. So you could pull a scale directly from this lateral line and a scale from anywhere else in the body, and they're going to look a little bit different. So fish do have two different types of scales. They're either typically cycloid or ctenoid, but the lateral line scales are going to look very different under a microscope. And they do have a little bit of counter shading. So if you look at the bottom of the body, it's very bright. It's more of a whitish color. And then the side of the body has a little bit of these stripes that you can see. And these guys will be nice and patterned when they're feeling good, when they're comfortable with their environment. If they're a little bit scared or if they're feeling sick, a lot of times fish will change using those chromatophores to be really dark colored. And they do have a fusiform body shape. So if you look directly head on at the fish, they have sort of a teardropped body shape. So these guys can be pretty quick. If you ever try to catch them with a net in a tank, you would know. So I think we can go ahead and get started, Keela, unless you have any last minute observations.
That sounds great. The last observation related to color was that John noticed that there was a variety of colors on the fin as well.
Yeah, and some fish have decorated fins. They might have different colors, or they might have spots on their fins. And some of these fish that have spots on their fins, that can be sort of an identifying factor. Knowing exactly where the spot lays on the fin can be very important in identifying the fish, as well as the position of the fins too. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you all had some good observations about that. Again, it's really hard to know all of these fish, so just being able to look at it and learn a little bit about its body is really important for just sort of educating yourself about them. So we talked about the mouth. Right up here near the mouth on the side of the head, you can see the operculum. So this is that bony covering that protects the gills. So the first thing I'm going to do, have my scissors here. Scissors actually give you a little bit better dexterity than a scalpel. Sorry for the gruesome sound effects. So you can cut the operculum a little bit on either corner, and you can see those gills. And we'll talk a little bit more about how they actually work when we actually cut into the fish. But what you can do is you can cut out one of these gill arches. So I've actually cut out 2 gill arches. See if I can separate them. So I've cut out 2 gill arches, and the gills on different fish are going to look different depending on what they like to eat and maybe their activity level. And you can actually look at these under a scope as well. I'm going to put them off to the side for now, and we'll come back and talk about their function a little bit. But there are 4 of these gill arches on either side of the body. So they have an operculum on either side, and they have gills on either side as well. And this is what they're using to breathe. And another interesting thing, if you look down into the throat, these guys have, they have little spiky pads right here. The glare, since it's kind of wet, might be tricky, but they have these sort of teeth inside of their body, and that's used to crunch hard things that they might find, like shrimp or crabs that might have a hard shell. So there's these pharyngeal teeth that will help them to crunch up their prey. So we took out some gills, and those are located at the front of the body, and we'll learn why in a little bit. And we'll come back, if we have time, we might actually dissect the eye and see if we can find the lens. But I do want to sort of get started and cut a little bit into the fish. So we did some initial cuts to find our gills, but you can actually cut and get into the main body cavity. So we're gonna make little tiny cuts. And if you had any questions so far, any other questions, you can ask them now while we're kind of making some cuts. And when it comes to dissection, you want to be very careful so as not to damage any of the internal organs that you're looking at. So we go in, but then we actually pull up a little bit. If you cut down directly into the fish at this angle, you might actually cut some of the internal organs. And the goal of a dissection is to be able to look at those organs and learn a little bit about maybe what they do, how they work, if there's anything wrong. So we can make a few other cuts here. One of them up, a couple of them up near the head. And we're sort of just running around the bottom of the body. You can start to open it up. You might have to cut a little muscle, some connective tissue to really get to look inside. And I'll make sure I move my hands away in a minute. All right. So there's a pretty good view of the inside of the fish's body. So again, we talked about some of the organs that might be the same between fish and humans. Some of those are, and I'll point them out, the heart right up here, this dark spot. We've got a stomach, which takes up a lot of room inside of this fish. We have some intestines, and we'll talk more about each of these in depth. There's a liver right up here. And we can't see it, but they do have a brain in there, a very tiny brain inside of the head. But there's also some differences. We talked about gills, and some fish have a swim bladder. And you can see there's a very tiny white line on the bottom here. This is a very tiny swim bladder for this fish. So let's talk about some of these things more in depth. And I'm going to see if I can get some of these intestines out of the way first, and then we can see a little bit better. All right. Okay, so let's start up here near the head. So one of the things that is similar between humans and fish is the heart. So you can see it's a very dark area. It's actually a dark red color. And that's because it's full of blood. So the heart's a very important component of their circulation. That is actually what's pumping all of the blood through their body. And fish have basically a one-way circulation. So the heart pumps blood directly here to their gills on the side of their body. So it pumps blood to the gills, and that's where it picks up oxygen. We'll talk more about that in just a second. And then it pumps it all the way through the rest of their body and back to the heart, which pumps it to get more oxygen as they use that oxygen up through their body. So it's a very important part of their circulation. And their heart has 4 compartments. And one thing that's really cool is that they have special cells inside of their heart called RE cells. And they're cells that are made to pick out pathogens like bacteria or viruses, and they'll destroy those, any that they find in the bloodstream to keep the animal healthy. So the heart will pump blood directly to our gills. So again, our gills are on the side of the body here. We took out a few of them, and I wanted to point out a few parts. So these ones are a little bit pale. You can see the color a little bit better this way. These ones are a little bit pale, but normally they would be also a dark red. And that's because they're also very full of blood. And that blood is what's picking up oxygen from the water to help them breathe. So the blood is going to be located in these gill filaments along the outside. They're kind of feathery-like. The very first picture that I had on our title slide was actually a blown up picture of a whiting's gill. So the gill filaments are full of blood. This is, like I said, called a gill arch. And there's a main vein that runs along the arch to carry blood. The filaments are full of capillaries, and capillaries are the very tiniest little blood vessels that you can have. And on the opposite side here, these white bumps that you see, those are called gill rakers. And gill rakers are going to look different for each different type of fish. But in this fish, they're just sort of hard bumps, and that helps to keep debris from going through their gills and damaging these important gill filaments. On fish that are filter feeders, these gill rakers would actually extend way out, and they would be long spines coming from the gill arch to help catch plankton. So the blood's going to flow through all these tiny capillaries and all these tiny filaments along here and pick up oxygen that diffuses in from the water around them. And then it's going to pump through their body. Now, I mentioned earlier that sharks actually will swim with their mouth open and just allow the water to pump through on its own. Well, I guess not pump through, but flow through on its own without them having to do much. That's called ram venting. That's one way to breathe. Another way to breathe is to actually pump this operculum. So it's a two-part method. They pull in water through their mouth, and then they push it out through their gills. And that is another way of breathing. That's pump venting. So these are all located up here on the front of the body. We mentioned these pharyngeal teeth, and those are in the esophagus. So the esophagus is what connects their mouth up here all the way down to their stomach. And off of the esophagus is where we might find this swim bladder. So I'll try to put it in the best light. This little white part here is their swim bladder. And that's a little compartment, like I said, off of the esophagus. And that is a little bit like a balloon, and that helps them control their buoyancy. So if they blow up that swim bladder and it's bigger, sort of like blowing up a balloon at the bottom of a pool, it's going to want to float up to the top. So that increases their buoyancy if they want to go up to the surface. But you can also, if you're a fish, deflate that swim bladder to swim all the way down to the bottom. This fish in particular spends a lot of its life on the bottom. That's where it's looking for its food. It has sort of a flattened bottom of the body. So they have a very, very small swim bladder. But some fish have differently sized swim bladders, and some have none at all. So actually, one thing that sharks use is a very oily liver to help keep themselves buoyant. And we'll talk more about the liver in just a minute. But that's what they use instead of a swim bladder. So our esophagus comes down. You might have a swim bladder coming off the esophagus, and food will go through the esophagus into the stomach. And the stomach is different for different types of fish based on what they like to eat. So carnivores have a very large stomach. You can see this one takes up most of the inside of the fish. And they actually have pretty short intestines. These are them right here. So they have pretty short intestines. Whereas an herbivore, if they're feeding on algae or seaweeds or other plants, they have a very small stomach, or maybe no true stomach at all, and they have really long intestines. I think everybody is pretty familiar with koi fish from a koi pond. So koi fish actually have intestines that are 3 times the length of their body. So 3 of these body lengths just in the length of their intestines, which is pretty impressive. But this is where digestion is happening. So they have enzymes that are secreted in their stomach to break down their food. But their stomach is a large muscular organ that helps to digest that food and pass it through the intestines. Now behind all this, like I said, they takes up a lot of room. Oh, and these other little guys here, these little things that look like little fingers, these are called pyloric cecae, and they are just extra little pockets that will aid in digesting fats. So some fish will have these pyloric cecae here. Behind all this, like I said, they take up a lot of room. This guy is a carnivore. Along the back of the body, you can see the kidneys. So the kidneys are actually sort of built into the body cavity here, but they're this dark red color. And kidneys filter liquid waste from the blood. So that's why it's nice and red. There's a lot of blood that flows through the kidneys. And they also regulate water and salt content inside of the cells. So if you're a fish living in salt water, but that amount of salt in your water might change from day to day, or even a couple times within the day, your kidney is very important in regulating the amount of salt in your cells and the amount of water in your cells, because if that becomes, if that gets thrown off too much, then you can actually, some of your cells can explode or will shrivel up. So that's why kidneys are really important for these fish, and especially important in that 1% of fish that can live in both freshwater and saltwater. And along with that is our liver. So you can see the liver. I've sort of laid it on the side of our stomach here. I'll see if I can pull it out a little bit. So the liver, so here's a liver for you, part of the liver. So the liver is very important for digestion as well. So it has enzymes that aid in digestion. It also stores some fats and carbohydrates inside of the fish. And it does also help to break down old blood cells and create new blood cells to help keep that fish in top shape. And this is the organ, like I mentioned, in sharks. They have a very, very large and very oily liver. And if you've ever combined water and oil together, you might notice, and if you haven't, maybe you can do that after you're done here. Put a little bit of water and a little bit of oil in a cup together, and you'll notice that the oil floats on top of the water. So it's lighter than water. So a fish with a very oily liver doesn't have as much trouble staying up in the water column. So we've got our liver here. See if I can, there we go. And blood will actually go right from the intestines into the liver to process those nutrients and also process any toxins that might be in their body. So the liver is important for breaking down and eliminating toxins too. One thing that I noticed about this fish, and maybe if you have some other observations or questions that you've come up with, you can type them in the chat box and we can come to those at the end. One thing that I noticed about this fish is its stomach looks pretty full. So I know this maybe makes me sound weird, but one of my favorite things to do is cut open a fish's stomach and see what is inside. So that tells you a little bit about what they might be eating, because you can actually identify the things that are in their stomach. So their stomach right here, what I'm gonna do, and I can actually feel things inside of there. You can cut the end off of their stomach very carefully. And we can make another little cut here. And sometimes they're so digested that you can't tell what is in there, but other times you can. All right, so it's sometimes a little bit like a murder mystery, trying to figure out what is in there. So does anybody want to take a guess? Feel free, if you do have a guess, to type it in the chat box. I think I have a guess. I found two things. They're kind of hard. This might be legs. It's pretty digested, but you can pick out some parts. Anyone have any idea of what this might be?
We have several guesses from Bonnie, Emily, Maggie, wondering, is it a shrimp?
That's what I think
Anya
too.
also think that.
Yeah, that's what I think. They've got a lot of long legs here. And I know it might be hard for you guys to see, but on the end of those legs, we've got tiny little, I don't know, you may not be able to see it, but they've got tiny little claws on the bottom of those legs, like the walking legs of shrimp. And that's what this hard piece right here feels like. It's part of the shrimp's shell. So, I mean, but this, if you look at the size, this is a pretty good size piece of food for this guy to eat. but I think it's a shrimp, so that's kind of fun. Sometimes they're not very well digested yet, and you can tell exactly what type of animal it's been eating. Now, if you were to cut the stomach open from an herbivore, like a menhaden or a mullet, they're full of sort of brownish, greenish, basically goo, because they're eating plant matter, and that's what you're going to find all mashed up in its stomach. But for carnivores, it's really fun to look at the stomach contents. Actually, one time I found a bluefish with 7 smaller fish inside of its stomach, which was oddly kind of exciting. So something else to point out too, just some other short, small things. This is where the spine would be along the inside of the fish, and their ribs actually come out from the spine along the side of the body. I can feel them a little bit. I can actually feel the bones on either side here. I might take just a minute to see if I can get what's called otoliths out of our fish. So fish don't have ears like we do, but they do make sounds, and they do need a way to pick up those sounds in the water. And so they have these ear bones. And if I can't get one out, I did save our otoliths from another fish for us to look at. So here in the back of the head, near where the brain is located, you might be able to cut inside and find these otoliths. And they're kind of fragile. And if we can't get it, I'll just show you the other ones. So sometimes you gotta, oh, here we go. Sometimes you gotta cut a little bit further. And, oh, nope, we got into the eye there. And sometimes they get a little bit crushed. So I'm not going to spend too much time. All right, I'm just going to show you this one from our other fish. So these are otoliths. You can see how small they are, but they are little hard pieces of bone. So these are basically the ear bones in fish, and they will pick up vibrations from sound waves in the water, and they will allow that fish to hear. So you can see those. They usually are small and white, and actually the rings on the otoliths can help to age a fish. So that's what tells you the age of the fish, which is kind of an interesting way to do it. A little bit like the rings on a tree. One other thing that you can do is you can look at the lens of a fish. So when someone talks about a fisheye lens, they have a specially shaped, it's a little bit slimy, but they have a round lens here. I don't know if you can see this little round globe. They have a round lens because of the refraction of light in the water. So I think that is, that's just a very basic introduction to all the interior of the fish. Another thing that you can find in fish is some egg sacs if it's a female. This one looks like it's an immature female. They will have 2 sets of eggs. And when they're nice and mature, those sacs of eggs will be very large, and they might have pink or orange eggs inside of there. So this looks like it's a mature female. So there's a lot of things that you can learn from looking at the interior of a fish. And one of the things that I want you to think about as we sort of finish up here and move on to our wrap up is, why is dissection important? What are some things that you can learn from dissecting either a fish or anything else? Maybe you have questions that you want to answer. What are some things that you can learn? So again, just to recap very basically, we have our heart pumping blood through our gills, which would be on the side of the fish here for breathing. The blood pumps through the body. Our esophagus is important for sending food to the stomach and processing all that food through the intestines. And actually everything comes out one spot on a fish, whether that's waste or eggs, and that's where we started our cut, and that's called the vent. So that's sort of the end of the line for a fish. We can't see the spine, but we know they're a vertebrate. And we did talk a little bit about some of those external features as well. So if you have any questions about fish in general, maybe something that we talked about, maybe something that we didn't, you can think about those. And also, like I mentioned, and I think Kayla typed in the chat box, is to think about some reasons that dissection is important and how it can be helpful. And one thing to remember is that it's not just fish. There's lots of things that can be dissected. So while I clean up my hands and get ready to wrap up, I think Ipsita is going to tell you about another way that you can do a dissection at home, one that you might even be able to do today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So again, remember to type in your answers to Lisa's question in the chat box and we'll come back to it. If you also have other questions, Lisa can answer them at the end, so make sure to type those in the chat box as well. So the activity for this week is a flower dissection. You'll be using the skills you learned from the fish dissection to do your own dissection at home. You can use any flower you want and as many as you want to try and identify its parts. And at the end, you can even press them to try and make art, put them in frames, put them in your journals, whatever you want. So again, if you have any questions, make sure to type those in the chat box, and I'll be turning it back over to Lisa in a second.
So it does look like we had a few questions come in on the chat box throughout your dissection, Lisa. Mm-hmm. The first one is on whether there are fish that breathe both air and water.
That's a great question. So there are some fish that can gulp air. There are some fish in other parts of the world that can actually process air pretty well. And around here, one example of a fish that can do that is our long-nosed gar and tarpon. They can actually do that. So they will, they'll actually sort of jump out of the surface of the water a little bit to gulp some air. But they're still processing that air. It's not like they have lungs like we would. They're still sort of processing that air through their gills, but also maybe helping with a swim bladder as well, because gar are a fish that stay near the surface. So they might gulp air for that reason as well. Because some fish actually have a little tube that connects their esophagus where they're gulping that air, and then their swim bladder, so they can gulp air and push it into their swim bladder to blow it up.
That is so cool, Lisa. And what I think is also really neat is there's a lot of similar adaptations elsewhere around the country as well. So a couple of our participants shared some from their areas. One was the Gulf sturgeon, and another one is the bowfin. So thank you, those of you, for adding that to the chat box as well. We had another question: is most of the tail muscle to help it move? Yes. So the tail muscle, or the section sort of right between the tail and the vent, the back part of the body, is called the caudal peduncle, which is a really fun word. And that is that section of muscle that gives the tail a lot of power, or the caudal fin. And that is what most fish are using to propel themselves. But there are some fish that might use a combination of other fins as well. Some species of pufferfish will use other fins instead of their tail. Or mola mola will use other fins instead of their tail fin to provide power. Thank you, Lisa. I think those are all of the questions that we have so far. And it doesn't look like we got too many responses to the question of why dissection is important. So I'm wondering if you could kind of share some of your thoughts on it and why you think it's really important for research. Yeah, of course. So dissection is really important, one, for just learning about the inside of an animal. So figuring out how something works. And that goes for not just animals, but other things too. I don't know if you or maybe someone you know out there likes to take apart different electronics or appliances to figure out how they work inside. And animals and like fish are no different. So
cutting open and looking at the interior parts allows you to see how those parts are constructed and learn a little bit more about what they do. And one of the things that's cool is you can actually look at, like I said, the stomach contents, and you can figure out what those fish are eating, and you can help to construct a food web to figure out where that fish and its prey and its predators fit into a food web, especially if you're looking at a particular area. It's been important for microplastics as well. So you might have heard that word. Those are tiny microscopic pieces of plastic that float around in our oceans, and they can sometimes get stuck in the gills of fish or end up in their stomach too. So they're actually being studied here on our campus to look at microplastics. And you know, there's a number of other ways depending on what type of animal you know, you're dissecting, but it can also tell you a little bit, particularly for us in the aquarium, about why an animal might have died. You can look at the organ functions or any parasites, or try and find a bacteria that might be present to find out why an animal has died unexpectedly. And the same goes for other animals as well. So those are just a few reasons, but it's a really cool tool if you don't mind getting your hands dirty. Any last minute questions?
I think those are most of the questions, but if people have additional ones, all of our information is on our website, which I believe IPSITA has added to the chat box. Also in the chat box, if you scroll back up a little ways, you'll see that we do have a 1-minute survey. This helps us really improve our programming. This is the first summer that we've done virtual events, so we really do value your feedback. For those of you that have been to a number of our programs and already filled it out, if you have time to fill it out for today, because the content is always different, that is still really helpful. And you will also see the directions for the activity sheet that IPSITA described and that she developed for us. And the chat box, when we end this meeting, will disappear. So what I recommend doing is going ahead and taking a minute now to copy and paste all of this into a new window or a Word document. You can also find those directions for all of the at-home activities for today's program on the event posting. So where you went to register, you can find there both the activity sheets and also a time-lapse video showing the dissection of the flower. And if you want to hear more about some of that research that Lisa was talking about, such as learning more about microplastics from stomachs of fish collected on our trawls, I do encourage you to tune in on July 21st for our Meet the Fleet public program. And every Tuesday at 11, we do have programs, and you can find that all on our website. So thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.